Thank you. Hi, I'm Nick. I'm a developer at thoughtbot. We're a consultancy that's worked with a broad range of clients. I'm small, some quite large. You might know thoughtbot from our blog or some of our open source work. We've done quite a lot of work in the Ruby community, and for the last couple of years I've taken over maintaining a few of these open source projects, and that's typically what I spend most of my non-client work time on. I also happen to go to uni here. Buttons are hard. By non-client time, I mean investment days. As a consultancy, we work 4-day weeks. The final day in the week which is typically Fridays, is a day which we invest in ourselves, the company or the community as a whole. As a 15-year-old company, this hasn't always been the case. A lot of our open source projects that you might know about, like FactoryBot, for example, were started on evenings and weekends, but this is something I'll come to in a bit. So I maintain a few popular Ruby gems. One of those is Administrate, which is a non-domain domain-specific language approach to building an admin interface in a Rails app. Another one I maintain is Appraisal, which makes it easy to test against different dependency versions in Ruby. So Administrate is often used on internal Rails projects. So I typically don't actually know where people are really using it. But with Appraisal, I usually come across it every so often, which is kind of nice. So I'll be like browsing GitHub and trying to read the source code and trying to look up what's going on, and I'll see it there, and it's like, oh, that's nice. That someone uses that. But as a maintainer, I think I'm pretty bad at it. Like, if you'd opened a PR or an issue in the last few months, I probably haven't seen it yet. I've pretty much took a couple of weeks off recently where I was moving house, and then I came back to 400 and something GitHub notifications. But that inbox is pretty much exactly like my email inbox. So, as you all know, that's always quite a fun situation. But before I go into that, let's talk a little bit about what I mean by open source. Nearly all, if not actually all, software is built on a foundation of software that's freely available and maintained by communities of people all over the world. I saw an interesting tweet the other day that was saying that 56% of software is built on something that's open source, which I think if you think a little bit about how software is commissioned, that might explain where that number might come from. I think there'd be something interesting there to work out how that's changed over time. So a good example of that, I think, is like Microsoft was always a bad open source citizen for years, and they've completely changed the way they work now in terms of that, and that's a definite change in the zeitgeist about how developers work much more in the open, more so than they ever have done before. But when we talk about open source now, we probably mean GitHub. It's got issues, pull requests, forking, but for a long time this wasn't the center of everything. Projects have been built around mailing lists, forums, blogs, and just sending emails back and forth. This is a Git patch, which is how OpenBSD, which is a derivative of the BSD operating system that came out of MIT, works. And it still does to this day. They email patches back and forth between people, coordinated through a mailing list, and that works pretty well for them. Some of these people are paid to do so, either directly or as part of their usual job. Like, for example, I am basically paid to work on open source stuff as part of my normal job. But the most majority of people do all of this in their own free time. Most of us who use open software also use it exactly as it is and don't actually contribute anything back. And a lot of my client work is actually like that. I worked on a project last year that was Electron node, involved Kafka in some ways, and also wrote a bunch of Java, and it contribute back nothing. Because there's no need to, because the software worked great. Like, there's no need to unless you want to make something different. So people maintain and or contribute to software for lots of different reasons. Sometimes it's marketing, sometimes it's a company built around a project, sometimes it's just fun to collaborate with people asynchronously all over the world. Overall though, the more people that contribute to the open source software that builds out all the stuff that we work on ensures that it gets better, and so does everybody who's contributing themselves. And if I say this as a developer, I've been working within and contributing to software that has a decent amount of users for quite a while, and it's made me a much better software developer whilst doing that. But most of the projects I now maintain, I didn't actually start them. I started a few. I've written countless API clients that are all open source and that I probably used once or twice and then no one's ever used ever again. So I can't really tell you how to make a project popular. But that's also not really where much the labor actually is. The things that keep projects going are reviewing code, responding to issues, setting the direction, and trying to build a community. Trying to get something popular is just a matter of combination of luck and timing. And you can't really predict where either of those two things are going to happen. But once you have users, that's where all the real work starts. I got started with Administrate after getting a lot of grumpy comments left on issue threads. It was somewhere along the lines of, is this still maintained at the light end, to implying some sort of hostile neglect on behalf of thoughtbot on the other. None of this is true. What actually happened in practice was Grayson, who started the project, had left thoughtbot and had gone to work for the US equivalent of GDS, and had gone to do something else. That was it. And was how that happened, and no one took over until I did a couple of months later. So taking over Administrate, I started by closing off old and invalid issues, and then old and invalid pull requests. And there's always some low-hanging fruit and documentation changes. And occasionally you'll get this one PR where someone's done a great job on fixing some Rails versions and compatibilities, and you can just merge it, and it's the best thing ever, because that takes up so much time. But then begun a lot of the harder work. What should we focus on documenting? What can we break? What should fit inside the next release? How will I actually find time to sit through and review all these PRs properly? And now, some nearly 3 years later, I've been doing this for now on this specific project, and I'm still pretty much doing all the same thing. So the thing with Administrate is it is almost by definition a broad project. As a user, you add it to your existing Rails application, you run a generator, and it generates some dashboards for the models that you already have, and it tries to avoid as much magic as it possibly can, but still tries to be helpful. But the trouble is, everyone writes Rails apps in a slightly different way. People will not do part of the implementation of what you'd expect. So if you have model associations between two things, you're supposed to define both sides of it. And something really common for people to do is to say this thing let's say like, that's a really bad one, isn't it? Because trying to come up with an object-orientated model example in your head is quite difficult. Okay, so a conference speaker has many listeners. And those many listeners belong to the conference speaker. What's really common in Rails is to forget the belongs to, but in Administrate, we use reflection to work out how those two entities are related to each other. So if you don't do it properly, then Administrate basically just blows up and goes, I don't know what to do. And that's commonly what happens in a lot of issues. And it's like, can you show me an example app where I can demonstrate this and I can go right into that problem? So that's quite common. But in general, it's like having hundreds of stakeholders, and some of them you'll only hear from once. Some of whom have requests that are reasonable, but from pretty much a wrong position, and you just try and let them down gently. But mostly it's a matter of running a project in the most ideal way you can, building a constructive code review environment, deploying regularly, making decisions in the open, and fixing issues in the shortest time that you can. So throughout these last couple of years, I've begun to think a lot more about project health. What does a healthy open source project look like? And I think there's two angles to this. One comes from the user standpoint, and the other comes from the maintainers. They don't necessarily sit opposed to each other, but they are different metrics by which we can track things. So this is kind of the way I've been thinking about it. So you want users to feel welcome to open issues and have their PRs reviewed in a timely manner and have a regular release cadence. And on the flip side, like, maintainers have pretty much the same desire. Maintainers want people contributing stuff and for people to be chipping in on open issues. And we want few regressions. It's like if I'm doing anything for a client and we're delivering a product, we don't want someone to be going, oh, it didn't work because all these minor bugs. Like, we want to be able to catch those during the development process. But as a maintainer, you feel a certain obligation to your users and your contributors. And sometimes this feeling is at odds with the rest of your life, and you don't feel like you can step away, and you're very likely to actually just overwork to make it all work. And if you're not careful, this leads to burnout. But fortunately, there's some documented methodologies for thinking about how we can measure project health. A person called Nadia Iqbal wrote about this extensively a little while ago and came up with an ideal. Administrator, and that's we've never gotten there. But that does happen in some of the smaller projects I've worked on. But thinking about the burnout thing, I previously mentioned our investment time as how I spend my time working on open source, but unfortunately it's not actually that simple. In practice, there's always other stuff that I need to do on a Friday. So it might be an office retro, it might be interviewing people, it might be just other things that I've become interested in and I'd like to spend some time on. So I might perhaps spend a morning a week of time actually spending time on administrating. But because it has enough users and enough open issues, this isn't really enough time. So what ends up happening in practice is that I also spend an evening or two a week to keep up, basically. And I've heard of organizations doing various similar things to us, but also specifically allocating time to ensure they're contributing back too. These time constraints are made worse by other expectations, some of which are imagined and some are real. I find the expectations are most strong around new Rails releases. Inevitably something will break, or there'll be an influx of new deprecation warnings, and then we'll need to fix that and cut a new release, because you can't upgrade. If you're depending on Administrate, you can't upgrade your app if Administrate isn't ready for it. So the expectation there is that we have a hard requirement to get that change in as quickly as we can. And then when there's a backlog of code to review, you really do feel like there's a mountain you're never going to climb. I think there's 80 or 90 currently open PRs on Administrate and well over 100 issues. So this comes from the Rails contribution guide. Open source is as much as helping yourself is as expecting to be helped yourself. So one of the problems with building on so much code that is open source is a lot of unseen infrastructure. So a couple of years ago, we heard about OpenSSL as a big example of this. OpenSSL is included in pretty much everything. It's included in my phone, it's included in a laptop. It's included in those weird internet-connected devices that definitely will hopefully one day get upgraded, which never will. And what you ended up discovering is that it's written in some pretty questionably easy to understand C, but also there's only one full-time maintainer. But that just provides like one example of it. What you end up having is, what that provides an example of is a common trend across technology. We quite readily fall into a tragedy of the commons kind of situation, where we're all at some point a free rider on a given piece of resource, and that resource is shared among everybody, but we're rarely contributing back because there's always someone that will, right? But I don't want to be too much of a downer. Maintaining some of these projects has been some of the most rewarding work that I've done. There's nothing like getting a first-time contributor's PR merged, only to have them come back in the future and opening new issues and PRs. And some of the funnest things has been in internationalization. I learned a lot about both Russian and Ukrainian by contributors, and discovering that they're quite similar languages, but for a Russian, Ukrainian looks a bit old-fashioned, which I thought was kind of interesting. And a lot of that's to do with pluralization. So we magically generate names for your dashboards in Administrator, but different languages pluralize in different manners. And sometimes people tweet nice things as well. But how can we make this better? Some of this is to do with financing, but some of this can be fixed with better tooling. I use a thing called a Octobox for managing my GitHub notifications. This screenshot is actually quite old, and there's only 139 in there now, which is quite impressive actually, because there's definitely 400 at the moment. And we can help people open better issues by providing templates. I can't remember what precise. Yeah, this is from Parser, which is a package manager for JavaScript, one of many. And if we can guide people to ask questions in a better way, provide more information, then they open better issues. And the reason isn't usually that people don't want to do it; it's they don't know what to provide when they open an issue. And then bots are great for this. People feel a lot better when you say something potentially negative, but a bot's doing it instead. So if a bot comes along and goes, "Is this still an issue?" then you're like, "Oh yeah, I'll reply," and we'll keep it open, and you can close stuff. And GitHub relatively recently released actions, which are a broader way of kind of solving some of the same problems. And more of it's just about making stuff easier to run. So having a good CI pipeline, which we test against multiple Rubies, so we can always see where stuff's going to break. Heroku review apps. Administrator happens to be a library that has a demo app, so it's a website as much as it is a library. And then when we're talking about the health of projects, we were saying that a healthy project is one that has frequent resolutions. And these resolutions don't have to be successful merges. Saying no is important too. This is Solomon Hikes. He was the person who came up with Docker originally. And some of this is closing issues or PRs which doesn't fit the vision for the project. Perhaps that might change in the future, and that's okay too. Jessie Frizzell has a great post on this where she talks about ways to close issues. There's the ego stroke and the close early, the push to try again, and the one about taking over patches. This is something I do quite a lot. I will take over someone's branch if I can merge it very quickly, and it's not valuable to probably have a small argument about the way we do code style. because it doesn't matter. So something I've been trying to think about is like, how do you build a community around a project? And the best way I could think about this was as a sales funnel. This is actually the 90 degrees. I should change that one day. So first time issues and first time users might cause a lot of drive-by contributions rather than anything deeper. And as you go further down the tunnel, the contributors are smaller than the original users, and the amount of maintainers are always a lot lower. So I'm a single person maintaining administrator, for example. So funding open source. So funding is about time and money, and we know that they're basically the same thing half the time. And some of it's coming up with a better way to compensate people for giving up their time, which makes it more sustainable. Companies should allocate more time. You should allocate yourself more time. So let's say you're working in an environment where you might do 1 week sprints. Well, give yourself some time during the sprint to contribute back the changes you had to make it work well for you. But we can also start companies that include a way to fund open source. Existing companies should be better open source citizens, but they've built on it. They should play fair. So one of the most common models is the open source core, and you see this in projects like Nginx or Elasticsearch or Redis. But unfortunately, the incentives aren't necessarily aligned. To force an organization to pay up, you have to do scope creep, basically, or either scope creep or artificially restrict features so that you can keep the business to be sustainable. So earlier I mentioned Octobox, and open source but paid hosted is the concept they're now following. So the product itself is open source, but there's a paid hosted version, and that's the one I use, basically because I don't really want to be hosting my own software in 2019. I'm happy to pay someone to run it for me. But if you wanted to host it yourself, you could, and it's well documented. And there's a few other concepts as well. Patreon is often used for funding open source contributions, and several others. But in general, big projects construct themselves better, but our own contributions to small projects make them so much better, and that's really where we can make a difference. Thank you.